And then on October 21st, we have, I won't go into too much detail. There's some more information that just came out in an email, and we'll have it out on the website. But we're going to do a creative post-processing event. Members will have an opportunity to creatively post-process 2 images. We'll all get the same images. They come back, and then we run through them with a group, similar, like a Zoom meeting similar to this. And then we'll, you'll be able to describe just, over a couple of minutes or whatever in that per image, what techniques you use from a processing standpoint. I did this with another group earlier in the year, and it was a fun way to learn a little bit about how different people post-process, and I came away with some ideas for myself on some of my images. And then the last thing that we have on our calendar for this year so far is the November 4th competition. That one is also open. The judge is Joseph Roybal, and we've had him do some of our judging before. So then that brings us up to tonight's presenter. Thank you again, Don, for joining us tonight. Don's a full-time nature and wildlife photographer residing in Estes Park, I believe, right?
Yes.
Estes Park? Okay, great. Specializes in the Rocky Mountains and Alaska regions, but also has traveled extensively throughout the U.S. with her camera gear, getting plenty of great, particularly wildlife images from all over the place. She's written many articles that have been published in a number of magazines. I think I see at least 2 or 3 of her articles in Colorado Outdoors each year. And also has, it's the Outdoor Photographer, Wyoming Wildlife, National Geographic, Digital, and Alaska Magazine. I'm sure there's several that I'm missing in that list. She also does, and feel free to go ahead and mention a few of your workshops that you have coming up, Don, but the ones that I'm familiar with are you do the brown bears of Alaska, and I know you've been doing that one for several years. Polar bears in Manitoba, fall photography in the Rocky Mountain National Park. Right there in your backyard, you've got elk, moose, fall colors coming up. So don't know if you had those ones coming in this year or not. And then also, I saw that you do birds in Louisiana, and I know you've done some of the road trips in that have included down there, and have some real impressive bird photography from there, which kind of leads us into tonight's presentation. Don has also been a guest presenter for our club a couple times, I recall, over the last few years, and then also has judged our wildlife themed photography contest. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Don. And if you want, again, feel free to mention if you have any openings, any of your upcoming classes or your events and that, and or go straight into tonight's presentation.
Yeah, this year's been a little bit different in trying to get things planned. Most of everything I've had has either been postponed or canceled for this year, but I thought I had somebody signed up for, well, I did have somebody signed up for the Rocky Mountain Fall Workshop, and she finally about 2 weeks ago said, you know what, this COVID's just not going away. So anyway, it's the joys of 2020 this year, that's for sure. First, I wanted to mention, Susan's been kind of quiet about this, but Susan has a photo that got it was a top 20, if I remember correctly, in the National Parks Competition for Nature's Best. So I wanted to congratulate her. I haven't seen her in a while.
I'm here. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. So that'll be, I think, in the next issue, right?
Pardon me?
It'll be in the next issue, the next print issue of Nature's Best.
Yes, and that was at Rocky Mountain National Park, actually.
Yeah,
you have a beautiful image in there.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't make the magazine, but I always feel like I get just close enough to just tease me. So I just keep pushing, just keep trying. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much.
All right, let me share my screen here and PowerPoint. So I do live in Estes Park. I am actually in Rifle at the very moment, working on a couple of things. I'm heading a little bit farther south, working on an article for Colorado Outdoors about night photography of all things. And hopefully the smoke is not too bad down there, but we'll see. We'll see what happens once I get down there. But can you guys see the screen? Is that showing up?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, yeah, it's
all right,
there.
perfect.
It looks great.
Perfect. All right, so he did a pretty good job of giving, Michael gave me a pretty good intro. I am originally I am from New Jersey, but I do live out here. I've been out here for almost 20 years now. I can't believe how quickly that's gone. I studied communications in my undergrad, and I have an MBA in marketing. But I've also over the years done some study with photography. I've done computer graphics. I've studied biology. I've studied public relations. So for a while I was pretty into I've always believed in education, so I've enjoyed learning different things. But I spent about 20 years in corporate marketing, and at that point I decided that I really just wanted to be outdoors. I wanted to kind of control my schedule, and so I actually walked away from that, and I do write and photograph full time now, working on articles, selling stock, selling prints, doing workshops, guiding. I have been pretty busy guiding in Rocky Mountain National Park. That was, I've been doing that for several years, but this is the first year that I got a permit under my business rather than working for somebody else. And that's been pretty interesting, because with everything with COVID going on, it seems like the private tours have actually done pretty well. People still want to get out and see things and explore the park. So that's always an option too, if you're interested in learning more about Rocky Mountain National Park. Especially this year, they have some new rules in place this year that I'm happy to answer if you have any questions about that. But bird photography is what we're here to talk about tonight. It sounds like you have an event coming up with HawkQuest, and they do a phenomenal job. There are a couple of different groups across Colorado that do these types of programs where they bring out their educational birds that can't be released back out into the wild. But they bring these birds out and do different types of setups. And I think HawkQuest is probably one of the best ones out there. They really have a good understanding of what photographers are looking for. They work with backgrounds, they work with perches, they work with different things. So I think you guys will find it really, really helpful. So in general for bird photography, I always, hopefully HawkQuest will give you an idea of what birds they're bringing before you get there. They usually have a couple of owls. If I remember correctly, I think they have a turkey vulture. Kestrels are usually one of the birds that they'll bring. So take a look at what types of birds they have to kind of get an idea of what types of photos you might already have and what types of photos you want to get. But ultimately bird photography is very much about behavior, and wildlife photography in general is about behavior, but bird photography in particular. Otherwise you just wind up with a lot of photos of birds sitting on perches. And after a while, those photos are important as part of a collection, but after a while you want to expand beyond that. So for example, there are things like you want to know, if you want to capture a flight photo of a bald eagle, you want to look for when they poop. They actually will poop before they fly. Now they won't always fly after they poop, but if they're going to fly, they will poop. So that's kind of an indication of being ready, focus on them. Same thing with a sandhill crane. The sandhill crane will, prior to taking off, will always lean forward. They kind of, it's almost like a running start that they do. It's kind of an interesting, but they will start leaning forward. And once you start seeing that, you've got a couple of seconds before they take off, and just be prepared to capture that flight shot. So think about the types of photos that you want to take, and then also think about what photos you already have so that you're not repeating them. Or maybe you have photos that you'd like to improve, so that's something else to think of. And feel free to ask, if you want to add into the chat, I'll take a look at it. I think I can keep it open here. If there's any questions about any of the photos that are in here, feel free to just drop a note in the chat and we'll take a look at those, and I can answer those questions. So kind of back to researching your subject. In controlled settings, there's lots of photos that are possible. Now, obviously in a controlled setting, there are going to be certain things. There's going to be the bands on the feet, and you might see antennas for the tracking device on them. But that's kind of part of this, and there are certainly ways to remove some of that post-processing. But you still want to capture the behavior. You still want to capture the flight, the intensity. A lot of these animals are enticed to land in certain spots with food. So focus on those places where the animals where the food is, and then focus on, so you get your focal point on that area, and then the bird will come in. You're already pre-focused on that, but capture the talons out, the eyes looking straight down. Wings out are a big thing. You want to make sure that wings aren't blocking a face. most people prefer photos of birds in flight with wings either fully stretched out or closed in all the way. Kind of these mixes of things can, kind of like this turkey vulture here. It's got, you know, its wings are both down in the same position, and then the same thing with this osprey and bald eagle. The wings are outstretched fully. So as I mentioned earlier, you definitely want to capture the bird on a perch photo. Those are certainly good portrait shots. But then improve the story and do things like birds in flight and portraits, behavior, and then don't forget about interacting with the handler. In one of the captive bird situations where I was actually photographing, I took a series of photos, several series of photos of the handlers with the birds, and a couple of them actually got published in Colorado Life. They were looking for the photos. So everybody takes all of the photos, you know, of the really pretty portraits, because in a captive situation, you can get pretty close to these birds. They take the photos of the birds in flight, but a lot of people didn't take the handlers, the whole environment, the story. So so kind of think about that too. So and I've kind of intermixed some wild info as well as captive info, even though I realize your event is a captive situation and a lot of that captive info will fit out in the field. There's still some behavioral components with birds that only apply in the field, that if you're looking for them. So here's a couple of tips that after you're finished at HawkQuest, and then you go back out in the field and use the skills that you've learned. Here are some ways that you can find birds, track birds, you know, get out and photograph them. Birds always, you know, they, like most animals, they follow the food. You know, bird feeders, seeds, random feeding opportunities. So that's what this scrub jay was actually down at Red Rocks Park. There's behind the trading post there in the wintertime, there are some bird feeders that some volunteers keep filled, and that brings in a lot of birds. So that's a really good photo opportunity because the birds are pretty comfortable around people because of the volume of people that come there. This finch on the right-hand side was actually photographed right outside of my door because we're all doing backyard photography these days. You know, so bird feeders in your yard can be a great spot to do some photography and do a lot of practice, because in your yard, you can actually watch the behaviors. You're there much more frequently. So you can see, well, what time of day do they like to come? Which direction are they coming in from? So maybe you can position your camera to be ready for that. You know, and then you get things like snow and other types of weather events that you can capture. And as well as in the backyard, they can get comfortable with you being there. I hear a lot of people do that with hummingbird photography. They set up hummingbird feeders, or they set up flowers that hummingbirds like. And then by being out there on a more regular basis, the birds get pretty comfortable with you being around. And then the other thing too is, you know, this is a shot actually not far from where I live in Estes Park. There was a bull elk that had passed away over the winter. And, you know, the birds can be very opportunistic, especially bigger birds like magpies and crows and ravens. And the, you know, I'd like this, although it's a difficult thing to kind of see, you never want to see death in wild. It does give an opportunity for the birds. So again, you know, I'm very much about storytelling in photography, so I like doing that. But as I mentioned, feeders are probably going to be your best bet after this event to keep practicing. So what other activities do you want to capture? In the wild, you know, birds feed their young, they bring in nesting material if you can find a nest. Obviously being very sensitive to how close you get to nest, because you don't want the parents to abandon it. Birds will defend territory, so they fight off different birds. You see that a lot in actually this previous shot of, you know, the bald eagle and the osprey. The osprey was defending some fish that it had caught. Birds will rest, you know, kind of like this owl sitting in the tree. They do, you know, they'll work on impressing the ladies. They, you know, you see a lot of that with, especially birds in like the Amazon and stuff. But, you know, sandhill cranes will do some dancing. You know, there's a lot of that type of behavior in the spring. Birds do a very good job of hiding in their habitat. So, you know, again, to me, it's a little bit of storytelling. They do a lot of preening. That can always be fun. That's what the spoonbill's doing. You know, feeding the babies. That's what this great egret's doing. And I wanted to add in a couple of slides. You know, we have the fall, you know, even though it's technically still summer, we're coming into fall, so the fall colors, and then, you know, into winter. So again, keep practicing after you're at HawkQuest. and the instructor there kind of gives you a lot of, tips and tricks and things. Take those things and make sure you keep getting outside and practicing. So these are a couple of different suggestions for you in the fall, to look for birds, any place where there's berries or nuts. Choke cherries are in season right now. Some of the scrub oak has acorns on it. So, birds will go after those types of things. Anything that's in your yard that might have berries on it. And then right now I know the crabapple trees are in season as well. So as those dry up over the winter, those can be great spots to look for birds and photograph them as they pull those crab apples off the trees. Your birds are getting ready for migration, so they're doing a lot of feeding. Babies are learning to be adults, and that can be kind of comical to watch them. And then fall colors, and that's what these two wood duck shots are of, fall color reflections in water, or fall colors in the background behind a real colorful duck. Ducks have a lot of color in them. And then as we get into the winter, we actually get a lot of ducks here in Colorado. So, and that's a great photo a practice opportunity for birds in flight, especially as the water freezes, as the temperatures get colder and the water freezes, where there's open water.
Sure I understand.
Sorry, Siri and I are having a conversation apparently. So as the water freezes and the birds kind of get focused into a much smaller area, it can actually improve your photo opportunities. But again, in the winter, bird feeders, ponds and lake with aerators so that the water stays open a little bit and they can keep swimming. And then what I refer to as fish kills, and that's what this bald eagle is doing, is that as the temperature drops, water freezes, it may kill the fish that's in the water. And then as the ice recedes and as the temperatures warm up, those fish will rise to the surface, and bald eagles will come in and take advantage of that opportunity. So just a couple of suggestions of what you can do with the skills that you learn after your event. So some tips about controlled setting photography. It is definitely great practice. That's why groups like HawkQuest are around. It's a great way for them to raise money to keep feeding their birds and keep their birds healthy, and cover medical expenses. And then in return, you get a great opportunity to practice your photography skills. Another benefit of it is, don't just, I put in here, don't get root feet, I call it. It was a term that I learned in tennis, actually, when I played tennis in high school, that you don't get your feet just planted and stuck there. In a controlled setting, you have so many different opportunities to take different angles. You can ask the handler to, let's try it on this side, or let's try it with this light, or let's try it with this background. You have opportunities to really control the setting to improve your photography. So if there's a bright spot in the background, move the perch that the birds are flying into or that they're sitting on. Keep the perch really far away from the background so that the distance between it really helps to blur that background out and it becomes much less distracting. Try different light, try different angles, try low angles, try direct angles, try a side angle, try different distances. So there's just so much that you can try in a controlled setting. And to me, that's what those opportunities are all about, is that don't get stuck in just one, the one thing that everybody's doing. If there's 10 people on one bird doing the same shot, maybe try coming in on the side or something to try to mix it up a little bit. So these are my gear choices for any of these types of events. I do have a 500 and I have an 80 to 400. Those are the two lenses I use the most frequently for bird photography. I do find that the 500 on occasion can be difficult, especially in a controlled situation like this, to track with a bird. It can be difficult to find the bird. It's a little bit heavier to move. So that's why I would recommend something in this middle range a little bit. The 150 to 600 lenses that are out there these days are also an excellent option. It gives you the distance that you want, yet they're light enough to move around. For a lot of these events, I don't use a tripod so that I can easily move. Tripods are somewhat limiting in that regard, that you have to set them up, and once you're in place, you're kind of limited to just that. If, however, the destination, you can set that tripod up and then get the camera focused on this perch. So this is what I was talking about with that landing shot, talons out. And even with the jesses are almost, which are the bands on the feet, they're actually really, really difficult to see in the shot because the feet are out. And I kind of thought about that. You know, if I'm directly looking at the bird, the feet, the talons are actually going to block those jesses on the legs. But we were using, in this particular situation, you can see there's a little bit of red there. I've kind of pulled the color out of it a little bit so it's not as obvious, but there was a piece of meat there that the barn owl was coming into. So I focused on that, gave myself enough depth of field so that when it came in, I was pre-focused on this, and therefore the rest of the bird is sharp. That's probably going to be your biggest challenge, is finding that right plane of field, in that you don't, you know, prior to the bird coming into this perch, you don't want to just focus on the bird not being there, because what will happen is your camera will focus on this tree in the background rather than where it needs to be on the bird. So that's where pre-focusing on the landing point actually will really help you with that. As I mentioned, too long of a lens can make it tough to track the bird and or to find the bird in flight. So, you know, it's a day full of practice. So definitely, you know, try different settings, and you know, if you have a couple different lenses, try one. Like I said, I usually wind up going back to my 80 to 400. I just find it's a little bit easier to maneuver. And then you want to make sure that you use a high frame rate. So all the cameras, I know my cameras, and I believe most cameras these days, have 3 settings. You can use a single shot, like a kind of like a medium speed frame rate, and then a high speed frame rate. And for bird photography, you want to keep it on a high speed frame rate. That'll make sure that you are getting, you know, let's say 12 frames per second, maximum number of shots as you hold that shutter down, the shutter button down. And then out of that, you can take the ones that are the best, that are the sharpest, that have the right wing position, that have the right eye position, have the right feet position. And then just make sure that you're not on single shot, because obviously a single shot, you know, you hold the shutter button down and you're only going to get one photo. That's what they did, you know, in film days. We have the beauty of digital photography these days where you can, it's all just pixels. So here's a couple more shots from that same photo shoot with the barn owl. You know, there's 2 different ways to approach photographing these birds coming in. I would say when you first start, unless you've done this before, when you first get there, position yourself parallel to the bird. So if the bird's flying from left to right, so let's say the perch is directly in front of you and the bird's coming in from the left, that would be parallel plane of focus. And that's pretty easy, because at that point you're tracking with that bird from the left to the right. So it's not changing its plane of focus. As you get those shots and as you feel really comfortable with that, try switching it so you're looking directly at the bird as it's flying in. These are a little bit tougher shots to get because that plane of focus is changing. Cameras these days are definitely getting much better with this, and you can actually set your autofocus point, you know, as that bird takes off, where you can actually track with it right down into where he lands. But definitely, you know, like I said, start off to make sure that you get some shots out of the day with that parallel plane of focus, and then switch to the perpendicular plane of focus with the bird flying directly towards you. Different settings. On this one, I did add in what I was photographing. This bird was pretty far away from me. You'll be in a situation, in a controlled situation, where the birds are a lot closer. But you can still use, you know, I always, you know, keep it wide open, you know, photograph at f4 to 6.3 in these wide open aperture ranges. One, so that you can give yourself a lot of light in your that reaches your camera sensor, so that you can actually get those faster shutter speeds. Because with bird photography, especially birds in flight, you want to make sure that at a minimum you're at 1/1000th of a second to freeze the action. And on this example, it's at 1/4000th of a second, and you can see it's actually even at that fast speed, the wings are slightly blurred, but the water's been frozen, and the bird itself is completely tack sharp. So the faster you can get, you know, the more you're going to get some of that. It can be interesting too, you know, to have, you know, at 1/1000th of a second, especially with a smaller bird, like if there's a kestrel that you have that's doing some flight shots. You know, the smaller birds, the wings, even at 1,000th of a second, you'll get some blur in there. And that actually, again, tells the story that it wasn't just, stopped in midair, that it was actually flying. So it gives the perception of movement, which helps the viewer understand what's happening in that photograph. The other thing that's really nice about the wide open aperture is that it will keep your backgrounds really, really small, especially if they're really far away from you. So that's what's happened in this photo. That background was probably about 25 feet away. So it actually, that bokeh really, really kind of helps declutter the background. So everything goes soft and your eye just gets focused on the bird itself, which is what you want. Always expose for the brightest part of the bird, and that, like on this example, would be these white feathers or the highlights in the water here. On the previous examples with these barn owls, it would be these white feathers under here. So you want to make sure that you're not blowing those out as they're coming in. So for, if you exposed here, if you did an auto exposure, or your light meter reading might actually tell you to open, to have a slower shutter speed because this is darker. What'll wind up happening is that this will all get blown out and you will lose all the detail in there, and you'll also potentially not freeze the action as well. So we already talked about setting your frame rate to high speed. If your camera offers it, you want to set your camera into Al Servo, which is on the Canon, or AFC on the Nikon or Sony. This is the autofocus tracking modes. And as the camera generations have been released, this has been improving pretty substantially. But every camera is a little bit different in where to find it. So you want to go into your manual prior to going out there on that I think it's a Sunday. Prior to going out there, definitely make sure that you set your camera into, whichever system you're using, make sure you get it set into this mode. Use the blinkies and your histogram. So the blinkies are what's referred to as, on my camera, it's called RGB highlights. And on the Nikon, it'll actually, you can change it in the menu, but on playback, it'll actually, anything that's blown out. So for example, on these barn owl shots, if this highlight on the front of this wing here was blown out, it would show up on the back of the camera as like a white blink. So that's why they refer to them as blinkies. But that tells you that you've lost the detail in that area, and you need to either you need to reduce the light somehow. So you either need to speed the shutter up a little bit, or you need a, maybe if you're at f4, maybe take your camera to f6.3. So you need to reduce the light a little bit. And then the histogram will kind of do the same thing. On a histogram, it goes from pure whites to, or pure blacks to pure whites. And you want to make sure you don't have a spike on either side. You want to be either, about center or just right of center with the actual graph of the histogram. And there's a whole set of instructions around some of that, but that's kind of the basic look that you want on that. And shoot in RAW so that when you're in post-processing, you actually have some leverage to bring down some of those highlights, open up some of those shadows, and do some more adjustments than you could if you were just shooting in JPEG. So other choices for settings: practice with your camera before you get out there so that you're familiar with where the buttons and dials are, because birds in flight, this pelican's not a really good example of it, but birds in flight are moving fast, so you want to be able to change things fairly quickly. Now, again, one of the benefits of the controlled setting is that you can say, hey, wait a second, I need to do some adjustments. Can you give me 2 seconds? That's only going to go so far, however, even in a controlled setting, because these birds eventually do get tired, and the handlers want to be really sensitive to not wearing them out. So, they might get maybe 10 flight shots before they say, all right, we're going to give this bird a rest, and we're going to bring out another bird for you. So you want to be real familiar with your camera prior to getting out there, so that you don't lose any opportunity while you're there. Photography is half technical and half creative. I think most of us have a strength in one or the other. So if you're creative, do some research on the technical aspects of your camera prior. If you're really adept at the technical aspects of your camera, do some research online prior to going out there. Do a hashtag on Instagram of bird photography, or captive bird photography or bird photos. There's all kinds of hashtags out there that work really well, so you can get some ideas of what you want prior to getting there. I think that's, we're all visual people because of being involved in photography. So I think having an idea of what you're trying to get prior to even getting there really helps you in kind of streamlining while you're there. Take a test shot in the current light. That's always really important, so that, again, so that even though in a controlled setting, you'll have multiple opportunities with these birds, you want to make sure that you're getting the most bang for your buck while you are there. If you're doing close-up portraits, such as like with this pelican, make sure you adjust your aperture for the depth of field. So for example, on a flight shot, the importance is the speed. You want to make sure that you're freezing the action of that flight and you're not blurring that bird out. In the reverse, the portrait shot, you want to make sure that, especially if this bird was facing me, I want to make sure that the eye is tack sharp. That's always the priority on bird photography. But you also want to have some detail in this, in their long bill. I've bumped this one up to F8 because this water was so far behind them that I knew that wasn't even at F8 that was really going to have some nice bokeh. And it was still 1/5000th of a second because I was making sure that this white on his head was not getting blown out. But the F8 allowed me to have, you can see there's a lot more detail in the feathers here. There's detail here in the front of it, even because he is turned a little bit. There's detail in the front of his bill down here, all the way back to the feathers on the back of his head. So this is a big bird. I would say there's probably about 2 feet between the back of his head and the front of this bill based on the angle that he was at. If you're looking straight at a bird because you're in a situation where it's a controlled setting, if you're going to do, straight on portrait photo, definitely at a minimum, I would say F8. You could even go up to like F11 and make sure you get the detail all the way from the front of the beak to, to at least slightly behind where the eyes are. If you're photographing something like a great horned owl where the ear feathers, you want to make sure those are sharp too. So in a portrait, and those sit behind the ear or behind the eyes a little bit. So you want to make sure you have your aperture adjusted to accommodate that. And again, you're in a controlled setting, so take a couple pictures and check them real quick before they move the bird out of that opportunity. And then at the end of the day, this is something I always try to tell people, remember to take your settings back to some sort of midpoint. I always recommend, my midpoint when I'm finished shooting is I like to return it to ISO 400 f8 1/1000th of a second. So that the next time I pick my camera up, because the mountain lion that just ran across the road in front of me, I want to make sure I can get the photo. And in most situations, it's going to do a pretty good job for me. So just a little quick tip for any sort of situation. I threw this slide in. Hopefully it doesn't confuse anybody. I can send, if there's any questions about any of this. But some of you may be familiar with this Sunny 16 rule. And this is if you're shooting at f16, but the idea behind this is that if you're at f16, whatever ISO you're using, your shutter speed will be the reciprocal value. So at f16, if your ISO is 200, your shutter would be 1/200th of a second. And that allows you to make sure that you get all the whites completely ready to go. They're not blown out. That's going to give you a pretty good histogram. Now for this, as I mentioned, you want to be a little bit wider open. So at let's say F8, you want to count how many stops of light that is, and off of how many more stops of light you're getting from F16. And then you want to decrease your ISO, well, increase your ISO, that same number of stops. So it doesn't become F16, it might be an F8 rule, but it's kind of the same concept. So hopefully that doesn't confuse anybody, but I wanted to throw that in because more than likely with the way the weather's been lately, we've had a lot of sunny days and you're probably going to have some bright sun out there. So beautiful images, make sure that your backgrounds are super, super important with these birds, and you're in a captive controlled situation. You can control what those backgrounds look like. This Caracara was in a controlled situation. We were photographing, this bird was sitting on a perch there was a pond behind him, and then behind the pond there was like a whole bank of trees back there, trees and vines and all kinds of stuff. But you can't even tell what that is. But because it was so far away, it just blurred out super nicely and created this super nice green background with no detail in it. And that really makes him pop off of that. So think about that when you're out there. So, you know, if they set up the birds at one end of the field or whatever setting you may be in, you know, if they set up the birds at one end of the field, see if you can position yourself wherever the background's as far as possible behind that bird. Definitely capture behavior. Like I said, this bird couldn't fly, so I didn't get anything more than just a couple of portrait shots with him. I took some that were on the side. I took some that were vertical. So I have horizontal, I have vertical, and then I took some with him facing towards me. So still in this side position with the body, but his face was facing towards me. And then I moved around to his front to photograph him directly on. So I did 4 or 5 different portrait shots, and then that was about all we were going to get because it was, like I said, he wasn't capable of flying. But if there's behavior, again, you make sure you're catching the eyes, catching the talons out, catching the wing position. As I mentioned before, capture the environment. You know, photograph the people photographing the birds. You know, that tells a story as well. You never know what you might want to do with them somewhere down the line. Anticipate the action rather than following the action. That's always a big thing with bird photography, so that you can make sure that you're getting the best action sequence when that bird's flying. And then general background or general wildlife tips. Again, backgrounds are as important as the bird. For general bird photography, I use something called a skimmer pod. It's actually made, I'm trying to think of who, some people, you can actually make your own homemade one out of frying pans if you want. But they actually, so it's a round metal, that's what it looks like, a frying pan. It's a round metal frying pan. And in the center, it has a post that on the top of it, it has a arca plate. And I attach my camera to that. And that allows me to hold the camera up without having to manually hold it, to position the camera about 2 inches off of the ground, and then I lay on the ground. And that was how I got photographs of this tern. But what that does is that rather than photographing down on the bird, you know, if I was standing up, you know, he's only a couple of inches off the ground. You can see where the rocks are here, or the sand. Even if I was standing 4 or 5 inches up, that would mean I'm kind of photographing down on him. And that would make this background much more detailed. But by laying down, you can now look much further back. And as a result, that all blurs back and it becomes much less distracting, and your eye really just focuses on this bird. So let's see, what else? Your eyes will be drawn to the lightest area in the photo. This may not be a great example of that, but you know, the bird's pretty bright. There are some bright spots back here, but that's something to keep in mind, again, with those backgrounds, is that you're in a controlled situation. And if you see a bright spot of sunlight or a reflection or, you know, a car or whatever it may be in the background, look for those things and move. You move a couple inches to the left, a couple inches to the right, or use that bright spot to frame the bird. You know, that's the other way that you could actually use that to your advantage. Let's see. Eyes will be looking forward unless they add to the story. So obviously in this situation, you know, the bird's flying parallel to me, so the eyes are looking left. You always want to make sure that if the eyes are looking to the right or to the left, they should always be looking into the shot. So you want to make sure that there's space in front of the bird so that it gives the feeling of movement into the frame. If I had cropped this out, you know, right in front of the bird, it wouldn't feel natural. It would feel like the bird's going to hit a wall, and you know, as it's flying or something. You also want to avoid, you want to make sure that the bird is, like this one is somewhat flying towards me. It's got a little bit of an angle in my direction. If it's just ever so slightly flying away from me, people will pick up on that. Especially if you want to enter photo contests or something, that's usually a pretty quick way for a photograph of a bird in flight to be eliminated, is that if it's ever so slightly with the eyes looking away from the viewer. Unless it's telling the story, you know, if there's, for whatever the subject may be, if it's telling part of the story, but in most cases you want to be able to see the eyes. Behavior is really, really important to tell the whole story. So you want to get, like I said, get the portrait shots, get the, the sitting on a post shot. But you also want to get detail shots. These are a captive situation. Take detail shots of talons, of the, of the beak, of the eye, of the feathers. I mean, you can really get in pretty close to these birds. So, unless the handler says otherwise. So try to get some of those things that you wouldn't be able to get in the wild. And definitely, more than likely, you're probably not going to have a ton of interaction shots with these birds, but in the wild, that's something like with these ibis, you want to, that's something that's always pretty interesting. And then the environmental portraits, that's what I was talking about with, getting photos of the handlers, getting photos of the other people taking photographs. These are your friends. These are people that photograph them having fun too. So that's always, it's a whole part of the day experience too. Other general wildlife photo tips: morning and late afternoon are when the animals are most active. So both of these photos were taken in the late afternoon in Louisiana. There's a park that I take people to where the reflections just get unbelievable, and the birds are fed like crazy down there. And in these parks, kids come up and feed them and stuff. So they're pretty comfortable around people, but in the late afternoon, you get these, the colors are just spectacular. The light's a lot better. They call it the Hollywood hour. So that is the best time of day. And I think that's when animals are the most active too. So this is a slide. You may have seen this before in some of the other presentations. I always try to remind people about this. So this is what I call, avoiding mergers. In this situation, even in a captive situation, you want to make sure that you're avoiding mergers. And what I'm referring to is that this shape of the sandhill crane, so this silhouette of this crane, has now blended right into the background here, and these shadows that are on the other side of the water. So even though you can kind of tell what this is, not really. Ideally, you want to make sure that there is a distinct separation of the bird from the background, or that it's not overlapping with another bird. You just want to make sure that your subject that you are photographing is clear, distinct, completely on its own. And this is what I mean by that. So this bird, now there's no intersection with a background. There's no intersection with other birds. It's just completely isolated, on that nice clean background. So that's something to think about, especially even in a controlled situation. These types of things can happen. So some of the, my wildlife equipment, as I mentioned, I tend to use my 500 and my 80 to 400 mostly for the bird photography. So I have a couple Nikon D4S bodies, which have a really fast frame rate. So that tends to be what I go to for my bird photography. But I also have a D800 and a D850, these are my landscape lenses. So in a situation like this with HawkQuest, I would say, if you have those different things, if you have a couple of different options, bring them, and keep both of them. Keep two different lenses with you if you have that option. The lenses that I have are a 500, 80 to 400. I have a 16 to 85 and a 24 to 70. Those two lenses are my landscape lenses. And then I have 105 and a 60 millimeter macro lenses. And those are the things that I use for flower. I don't use them as much as the other four lenses, but I use these for flower photography. I've used them on things like turtles. I actually have used them in captive situations if I want to photograph feet. So those are just a little bit more of an artistic lens. Actually, the 105 I actually use for a lot of portrait stuff too. Other equipment, I do have a 1.4 and a 2.0 teleconverter. Both of these are really helpful for when you're photographing birds in the wild, because wild birds are going to be a little bit more sensitive to human disturbance, so they might take off. You're more than likely not going to be able to get as close with them. I do struggle a little bit with the two teleconverter. It just isn't as sharp because of how much glass you're adding, but in certain situations it is nice to have that reach. And then I do have a carbon fiber robust tripod, which is made by B&H with a Wimberley gimbal head, which is phenomenal for wildlife photography. It just gives you so much more reach. You basically get 360 degrees in all directions. And I also have a ball head called a Unique Ball, which is actually a much more compact ball head that still gives you a 360-degree reach. It has 2 balls on it, which is actually kind of interesting. If you're looking for a new ball head, I would take a peek at that. For photographing from my car, I do use a beanbag, and then I mentioned that skimmer pod before that I use for bird photography, especially smaller birds out on the beach, out in situations where I want to get down at their eye level. So that's everything. Those are the tips that I have for bird photography. I mean, there's there's whole books written about this. So we're at 10 to 8. So for a half-hour presentation, that's a pretty quick dive into some of the tips and things. If you're looking for a little bit more information, NAMPA did just release a bird photography handbook. It is free to anybody. You can just go out onto nampa.org if you're interested in taking a look at that one. And then as Mike mentioned earlier, I've got a couple of things that I'm working on. There is this bears book. It is coming. It's been delayed like crazy because of everything going on with Pebble Mine, but that was the goal of the book, was to actually help stop Pebble Mine. So my co-author Drew and I are actually waiting on a couple of different things from a couple of people, and hopefully I can get that in the next week and get that finished up. He mentioned that I do go up to Lake Clark every year. This is an ebook that I have, and I have calendars as well, but I would sign up for my mailing list. You can do that on my website, which I'll have a slide with that in a moment. I do go up to Lake Clark every summer. This was the first year, and unfortunately I haven't because of COVID, but we are going up next year in July. I'll probably be up the following year in August. So we go up and photograph those guys out on the beach. Churchill trip, that was actually postponed to next year. So as a result of that postponement, I did have one person back out. So I do have one spot on the polar bear trip. And then, as was mentioned earlier, I do a workshop in Grand Isle, Louisiana. That'll be in April, barring any, who knows what'll happen with the virus. But as of right now, I'm planning on doing that. That's a really interesting place because if you're into bird photography, that's the spring migration route. And as the birds come up out of Central America and South America and fly through the Gulf of Mexico, Grand Isle is one of the first places where they hit land. So if, the birds need to refuel, they need to rest, and you just get a ton of birds in this location. And because it's a beach, it's an island that has a lot of homes there. The people that have homes, they have mulberry trees, and they have all kinds of different trees with different berries on it. So it attracts everything from, I've photographed a lot of brown pelicans out there, a lot of shorebirds, there's a lot of wading birds. There are, like I said, a lot of songbirds. So it's just a huge mix of birds out there. So that's always a fun time, photographing the birds down there. And then I always love sharing this quote, the most compelling photographs you take begin with the things about which you're most passionate and most curious. So if you're into birds, particular birds, usually I like photographing some of the bigger birds and wading birds. But there are a lot of people out there that really enjoy just songbirds and smaller birds, and they're a little bit more challenging because of their size and harder to find. So find those things that really, really intrigue you, and just kind of stick with it. So here's my contact information. It's I'll go back to that. I'll leave it on this slide, and that way you can write that down. And then, so let me see if there are, oops, sorry. Let me see what's the chat room looking like.
I'll roll through a couple of those. There was one question on, is there a maximum ISO that you usually will tolerate or use?
So on my camera, on a regular shooting day, I go up to about 1250. The max that I'll shoot at is about 3200 if I need the light. If I really need to, if it's a really low light day or something, I will go up to 3200. That will vary on cameras though. Every camera is a little bit different in how it handles ISO. So for example, that D800 that I have, I don't like to take that above 800 ISO. The D850, however, I've been shooting up at 3200 without any issues. So you have to kind of know your camera to know what you're comfortable with. But yeah, on mine, it's about, 1250 is, pretty average for me, and 3200 if I really need the light.
Okay, great. Let's see here. There was also There were a couple just comments in here and that, but then if I go to the questions, there was one, do you like to use flash in a captive bird shooting environment?
I do not use flash. I'm not a big fan of the way that the light looks. I don't think it looks natural. To me, it's just a little bit more about the natural setting. I haven't had too much of an issue of capturing birds. I know there are a lot of people that do like to use them, and then you can use better beamers to actually help direct the light too, which is a pretty inexpensive accessory that attaches right on, it velcros onto the flash.
Right, probably for when they're stationary and that might work. But and one person did mention in here about that at this particular venue they have, and I recall this, like some of the owls in that they have up in trees, and so sometimes it could be a little bit contrasty there when you're trying to get those shots. I don't know, maybe a flash might be helpful in something like that. I can't remember if they allow flash at these or not. Something
That I don't remember. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, that's kind of, these are captive birds. They're pretty used to probably a wide array of different things. They get shuffled around in vans and trucks and things. But yeah, I'm just not a big fan of flash with wildlife. It's just a personal preference.
Sure.
They claim that birds aren't bothered by it, but I've seen certain situations where animals will flinch with it, but
react to it in a way that's unnatural and that. So I understand. Let's see. Rich also did. Thank you, Rich, for he put out there the link to the handbook that you had referenced, the NANPA handbook, the bird photography.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
So that's out there on the chat if people want to pull that up as well. Let's see. Oh, and let's see. Bruce did put out the list of. There was a couple questions you were bringing up. What birds they were intending to put out there and that. So there is a list out there that Bruce put out there. It's under the Lone Tree Photo Club. Posting there on the chat. Let's see here. Here we go. Will you do a book signing in Estes?
Yeah. Once the book comes out, we will be doing more book signings, both in Colorado and up in Alaska. I did one earlier this year before the shutdown, and we were supposed to do another one in the summer. Everything's virtual, so it's kind of hard to sign things virtual. But yes, once that's out, I'll keep everybody posted on what's going on with that.
Great. Let's see, and then we had a question here. What type of metering mode is preferred for birds sitting on a perch versus something in flight? So
I use a single point metering mode for birds. So there's two different things. You can, there's matrix metering, single point, based on how you read the light in the scene, and then there's also an autofocus point. So I'm assuming they're talking about the light, but it's usually what the metering mode refers to. So yeah, I always use the single, just because in wildlife photography, you want to make sure that the light is a representation of that single subject. You're not worried about the background. You're not worried about everything else. You want your viewer to look at that bird. The difference would be in a landscape photography. Then I switch in a landscape photograph. I then switch it to matrix, because now I'm trying to get the light of the whole scene. So in the matrix metering, it takes more of an average. But with bird photography, I use that single point.
Single point. Okay, that's a good point. I'd never thought of that one myself. Usually just keep it on the same one I'm using for the, but like you say, the matrix that I use for the landscapes. That's a good idea though for like you say, for the wildlife, for birds in particular. And then you answered all the questions that I had on here. I think most of the questions that I see up on the chat box are answered. Just your presentation was so thorough. I'd answered the 3 or 4 other ones that I had. So it sounds like you're using primarily manual on everything as far as the shutter, ISO, and aperture, not like shutter priority and then auto ISO or something like that.
No, so I do everything. All of my photographs are done in manual mode. I do have a setting on my camera, even though it doesn't really make a difference because I'm doing everything manually, but I do max out my ISO at 3200 if I'm doing automatic. So if for whatever reason, if I switch to aperture priority, then yeah, I would max out at an ISO of 3200. But yeah, I do everything in manual. And I even joke anytime I take somebody out in the field, like I just had somebody, let's say Thursday, I think it was on Monday, I had somebody out in Rocky, and I was like, all right, well, we don't let you shoot in automatic, so we're switching you off. I mean, just before we even got out of the truck, that's my goal, is to get everybody on manual. Because I think once you have an understanding of that, and once you can get good photographs and good exposure with that, I think then you have a pretty good understanding of how your camera operates and how you can control what your photograph outputs as.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. The one more question that came up here with regards to the metering: do you use spot or center weighted metering?
So I use spot, mostly because that center weighted, you really don't want your subject in the center of the frame. I use a spot and then recompose.
Got it. Okay, great.
My dog just sighed. I think she's bored. hopefully that's not a sign of.
We'll turn you loose here in a few minutes. What I was just going to say is this was phenomenal, really. Thank you so much. I mean, all of the detail, and to just spontaneously put this together just in a few days' notice. This was really thorough, and I know I learned a lot from it. You know, both. And what I really liked is that you hit some of the points here on, control, like what we'll be doing here at the HawkQuest event in a controlled environment, and then how to carry those tips, but also just some of the other techniques that you would use out in the natural environment. And that this really was really thorough.
Yeah, I mean, that's why you guys are doing this, is so that you get some good practice, so that you can then take those skills out where it's a little bit tougher because you can't control what your subjects do, what your models do.
Right. So while there aren't any other questions, there's just a lot of good points on just how great the presentation was. Everybody really enjoyed it, which doesn't surprise me. This was fantastic. Thanks again for coming. And we can open up. Bruce, do you have any other questions? Did you see anything out there that I missed on the chat box?
I don't see any other questions. I just see one question. Are you back button focus shooter? I'm assuming.
I am, yeah. As a matter of fact, I kind of was pushing back on that for a long time, but yeah, about a year and a half ago, I switched to back button and kind of kicked myself for not doing it sooner.
Yeah. So, and then that's about the only question I see so far. I appreciate it, Don. Thanks for the short notice and bailing us out. And it was a great presentation. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I actually put that date down. I'm hoping to start heading out east. I want to try to get some fall colors out east. I need to go see my mom. I think she's getting a little, with everything going on, I think she's getting a little lonely out there. But if I'm still in town, I was actually thinking about stopping down there. So I'll keep you posted.
Great. Yeah. Thank you again very much. This was fantastic.
Looks like your dog gave up and went to bed.
And thank you, Bruce, for putting this together, for putting the presentation together, and Rich, actually, for coming up with the idea. Like I said, it just came up in one of the comments that came up in one of the meetups of suggesting that we put something together to prepare for the event and for bird photography in general. And that kind of led to this. And this is one of the larger turnouts I think we've seen on our Zoom presentation. So it was obviously very well received. So thank you.
Yes, thanks. And we'll post this once I get it processed to our YouTube channel under Lone Tree, so you'll be able to watch this again. All right.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Have a good one. Stay safe out there.